Welcome back to another episode of Keep Austin Safe. I'm your host, Clara Ash, and today we're introducing you to the Austin Police Department's Victim Services Unit. This team is here for people during some of the hardest moments of their lives, providing support, resources, and a human connection when it's needed most. So joining me today, we have a very special guest, Miss Emily Westerhoff. She has been with the Austin Police Department and in the Victim Services for just a little over 2 years now. So Emily, thank you so much for joining us. We're so happy to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
We want to dive kind of right into things. Victim service counselor, can you just tell us more about it? What does that job entail?
Yeah, so our biggest job is to act as support and care to people who have either experienced or who have witnessed crime. And so that might look like on-scene support. It might look like criminal justice advocacy. It might look like walking someone through the process, going over referrals, information, community resources. It just kind of looks like whatever the victim needs in that moment to recover from and, kind of process this crime and all of the next steps that come with it.
And this is a job, not your typical job, right? It's not your office. You clock in, sit down, clock out, right? When you go into work every day, what does that day look like? What do those days entail?
Yeah, so it's going to depend on what kind of team you're on. So you've got the crisis team, and then you also have the investigative support team. So crisis, their whole job is to show up to the crisis. So they might get paged to a variety of different calls. It might be a robbery call. It might be a homicide call. It might be a death notification. It just kind of depends. So their day more or less looks different kind of every day. Investigative support team, we are assigned to a specific crime type. So I work for the domestic violence unit. So 90% of my job is domestic violence. And so, whereas crisis is out in the field, I'm at a desk in my office. I have my fridge. Most of my days look pretty similar. So it's going to be a lot of victim outreach. It's going to be a lot of liaising and working with other kind of law enforcement professionals, including like the prosecutor's offices. And then it's going to be a lot of just kind of supporting that victim however they need that. Sometimes that's going over housing referrals. Sometimes that's making counseling referrals. Some of the counselors actually provide counseling themselves. A lot of us are working on our clinical licensure or have it already. And so, yeah, it's going to be very much kind of whatever that victim needs. And our day is going to look different kind of depending on where we are.
You touched on this a little bit, and I'm actually really interested in, you talked about, some of you guys are in office. Some of you guys are actually responding to the scene. Those people who are going out when that 911 call is made, what type of calls would warrant a victim services counselor headed out to the scene?
Yeah, so most of the time, victims can have the opportunity to request it. There are also certain crime types that are auto dispatch. So sex crimes, pretty much all of them are going to have as a victim services counselor show up. The victim is not required to talk to us, but it is kind of our policy to show up or at least touch base with them due to kind of the nature of the crime. From there, though, besides kind of the auto dispatch for sex crimes, it could be anything. And so, as IST professionals, we are trained in crisis. And so I've worked a number of crisis shifts, though not nearly as many as someone on crisis. And I've worked, most of mine have been domestic violence, but I've also worked a number of death calls. I've worked a robbery scene to the hospital. Sometimes it's a traffic incident where maybe there are kiddos involved and we need to figure out some sort of transport. So it's not always like the worst case imaginable, but I've worked a case where I had to provide transport to someone getting a forensic exam. It just kind of depends. But functionally, it's kind of we're at the request of either the officers involved, if they feel like the victim could benefit, or from the victims themselves.
Some of these crime scenes are especially traumatic. You're talking about a homicide, an aggravated assault, something where someone witnesses something and it impacts them immediately, right? Mm-hmm. So once you arrive to that scene, or a victim services counselor arrives to that scene, what are those next steps? Can you walk us through kind of what that looks like on the scene after you arrive?
Yeah, so on scene, first we got to make sure that it's safe to show up. So officers will have handled kind of the initial safety component. The suspect might be arrested, they might not be on scene or whatever, but we'll make sure that it's safe to show up. And then, we'll touch base with the officer on scene. They'll generally give us a debrief of what's been going on. They might tell us, hey, we've done this step and this step, but we're still waiting on this step or whatnot. And then from there, we'll touch base with the victim. And, depending on what's been going on, they will need a variety of things. So, for example, if it's a death call, then we'll go over funeral home options with them. If it's a sexual assault call, then we'll talk to them about their options regarding like a forensic exam. There's a time limit for a forensic exam with a sexual assault. So we'll kind of walk them through their options. Maybe they want to get it tomorrow. If it's a domestic violence call, we're going to talk to them about safety planning. Do they have somewhere safe to go tonight? Do they have somewhere safe to go tomorrow? What do the next several days look like? And then what does the larger picture look like? We'll talk to them about protective orders and, whether they need to relocate. And so it's going to depend on the crime type and what is needed, but it's basically going to be doing whatever we need to get that victim to a stable and safe spot, And so it might be, hey, do you have a friend who can come by and spend the night, right? It might be kind of working through emotional regulation, right? They might be having a really hard time. They can't even kind of get to baseline. So we'll kind of be a supportive presence to get them to where they can kind of function again. It's just kind of to depend on what has been going on and kind of what happens next. So, maybe some evidence still has to get collected. We'll walk them through that. It'll just kind of depend.
I want to touch on something you just said that stuck out to me. You said we want to get them to a point where they can function again. When someone's a victim in a traumatic event like this, they carry it with them for weeks, months, sometimes years after that. So for your job, it is sometimes long term. What does that process look like? How do you keep supporting victims and families of victims as well after they witness or are part of a traumatic event like this?
Yeah, so that's where the investigative support team is really going to come in because crisis, they're not going to follow the victim through their case. So let's say, because I work in domestic violence, let's say we've got a domestic violence case and, the police report was written last night, maybe the victim stayed with her mom last night, but now it's the next day, right? And so the police report was, say, written last night and now it gets assigned to a counselor. So let's say it gets assigned to me. And so I'm going to read over everything. I'm going to kind of look through their history. Maybe this is the first time this has happened. Maybe it's not, right? And that might be important information that could inform my conversation with that victim. And so from there, it'll be a matter of contacting them, usually over the phone, but sometimes it's going to a hospital. Sometimes it's making a home visit with a detective. It just kind of depends. And so, it'll be a matter of following up with her and kind of explaining next steps on our end and then figuring out next steps on her end. And so, for some victims, that's pretty straightforward. He was arrested. She's moving out of state, done. But for a lot of our victims, that's going to include kind of ongoing follow-up. And so, we'll walk them through the protective order process. We might go to the protective order hearing with them as support. We might kind of advocate for them either with the detective or through prosecution. Travis County has the high-risk team, which has been really instrumental in keeping a lot of victims safe. And Victim Services is a big part of that team. And so, it's our honor. It's honestly one of my favorite parts of the job is to work with that team to figure out how to keep victims safe. And so, that might look like advocating for different bond conditions. Maybe he's not following the bond conditions. So, okay, can we get a GPS monitor, right? And so we'll follow the case more or less until all of that is settled and it's like in the court system. Once things are in court dates, I'm a lot less useful because I don't really know what's going on with the court date except, what either the counselor or the prosecutor's office tells me or what I see, on the Travis County docket. But, getting to that part is where APD Victim Services really comes in. And then, for some of my victims who I've made really good relationships with, I wouldn't be surprised if, they end up calling me, right? I've definitely had victims who've called me after something happens with their case that they want to discuss. And so for some of them, we kind of keep them as their case progresses. And, she knows that, like the one I'm thinking of in mind, she knows I can't actually do anything with the courts at this point. That's not my purview, but I can still be a support to her as she is dealing with all these next steps.
And I know when people go through the process of, processing a crime and all that, a lot of time, this is the first time that someone is dealing with a police officer or dealing with law enforcement. And to put it quite frankly, that can be scary when you're looking at someone, in the uniform, anything like that. And you come up as a professional staff member, that's kind of a different, maybe a more comfortable face for them to look to. How do you handle those situations when someone is afraid of law enforcement and just a little bit intimidated by the whole scene of all these officers standing in their home or outside their home or in their personal environment?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to recognize, right? Like, officers don't get called out because things went well. They're already showing up to a pretty terrible situation. And then, historically, people have had all sorts of experiences. And so, the biggest thing is that people can call victim services and not file a police report. Maybe you don't want to make another report, but you want information on relocation, or you need to get out of your lease, or you need information on counseling referrals. You can just call the victim services main line. You don't have to file a police report. The other thing is that because we work so closely with law enforcement, victim services counselors can often advocate. And so maybe the victim that I'm working with, maybe she doesn't feel real comfortable talking to a detective. But if she comes in for an interview, I can be at that interview and I can make her feel a little bit calmer. And so, that's where, hopefully we can be an intermediary where appropriate. And hopefully we can be support because, it can be a really intimidating system, throughout the whole process.
When you talk about being able to talk to a counselor without even having to file a report, I know you guys have so many resources, a lot that Austinites don't even know about. Can you give us a closer look at what you guys are able to offer the community?
Yeah. So generally speaking, it's going to vary a little bit by crime type, but we can definitely give information on kind of all sorts of community referrals. So whether that's counseling, whether that's resources, financial resources, whether that's housing referrals. I mean, obviously housing is a huge issue in Austin. And so that's one that comes up a lot. In certain crime types, we might be able to help you get out of your lease. We might be able to help provide financial support in some circumstances. We often can provide things like cameras or 911 phones. So a lot of people don't know that a phone without service can still call 911. And that can be a genuine lifesaver for someone whose maybe normal phone is being controlled by someone who's abusive. And so if they can have a secret 911 phone, they can use that to call 911. And I've seen countless cases where that's been the case. And so, that's something that we can offer. It's also something that we're always looking for. So if anybody has a phone that they're not using that doesn't have any service, they can actually turn that into the police department and it will get used for victims who need it most. So those are the kind of the big ones, but, then it might also include, we can help sometimes with more immediate needs like clothing or food, that kind of thing. It just kind of depends on the situation.
So if someone feels like they might need your services or maybe knows someone who might need your services, what are the next steps into getting those into action? And also, do they have to be a victim of a crime or can they just call you guys for other issues, or how does that work?
Yeah, so typically we're going to serve victims of crimes and their families, and then typically witnesses of crimes. That being said, we would encourage kind of anybody who's looking for support to call the Victim Services main line. It might be a situation where we're probably not the best source of help for that, but we can usually point you in the right direction at that point. But yeah, there doesn't have to be a police report. We are kind of happy to help route where needed. But yeah, especially things like domestic violence, sexual assault, where maybe someone doesn't want to make a police report, but still needs help getting out of their lease or looking for counseling referrals. We can do that. That's definitely doable.
I know there's a lot that you see on a day-to-day basis, and you've obviously dealt with a lot of different crimes and a lot of different victims as well. If you could tell Austinites just one thing about the victims of trauma and what they have to go through and what that process is like, what would that one thing be?
Yeah, so I'm going to cheat, and I'm actually going to do two. The first one would be that there is no set identity for a victim of crime. So if I'm talking about domestic violence, for instance, people often think of women as the primary victims, but you can have male victims, you can have gender diverse victims. And so, I don't want people to think, oh, domestic violence only happens to women, so therefore what's happening to me doesn't count or whatever. And that's true for, any number of crime types, right? Sexual assault can happen to anybody. Same thing with kind of anything else. And so that's the big one, is that there is no set identity for who could be a victim of crime. It could be anybody. And then with that, there is no set response to trauma. We know that the way that trauma affects the brain means that people will respond in a number of different ways, sometimes that don't really seem to make any sense, right? So you'll see victims who have been through something traumatic and they'll start laughing. It's not because what happened is funny. It's because what happened is activating hormones in their brain that are designed to kind of make things feel better. So they'll have kind of this incongruous laughter. And so, people often think, oh, well, she's not crying, so it's fine. Or she went to the work now the next day, so she's fine. And really, trauma affects everybody differently. And, all of those responses are valid.
And this is a job, to put it quite frankly, this is a heavy job. You deal with a lot on a day-to-day basis, and people are coming to you at their worst moments and unloading all of this on you. How do you balance, I want to get it personal here, how do you balance helping them out with your own mental health as well? I know that that's a lot, that you have to be there for them, but also be there for yourself too.
So it helps that I genuinely love my job. And I'm not saying that because I'm the person they picked to be interviewed. I genuinely love my job, and that helps a lot. I genuinely love the people that I work with. We have an amazing team of counselors. We very much enjoy hanging out together. Someone brought banana bread this morning. It's a great place to work, and I work with great people. And that goes a long way. If I have a really hard case, I have 7 other counselors in my hallway, plus a supervisor, who I can go be like, listen to this terrible thing. So I'm not the only person who has to hold it in my brain. So that's a big part of it, is that we have a great team and we're good at intentionally supporting each other. I also have worked really hard to cultivate a supportive community in my outside life. So I have a great network of friends. I have a great network of a church community. And so I have plenty of people who intentionally kind of pour into me. And then I also have made it a priority to develop hobbies and workout routines that kind of help alleviate this stress, right? And so I love reading. I love horseback riding. We're going to a rodeo next week, right? And so all of us have done a really good job, I think, of cultivating hobbies and things that get our own nervous system back down to baseline. And I think that we couldn't do this job if we didn't have those routines.
Absolutely. No, that balance is so important. I know that in my life too. That's having those outside things really helps. But you've been here for 2 years now.
Yeah.
We hope we have a lot of years down the road here. So in Emily's world, in the future of APD Victim Services, what are your hopes for that? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, expansion of the team, right? We could always use more counselors. We could always use a bigger crisis team. As Austin continues to grow, there's always going to be a need for more victim services, unfortunately. With that, nobody goes into victim services to make any money, but I'd like to make a little more. That would be fun. Training, that kind of thing, that would be a goal. But really just kind of continuing to build on the infrastructure that we've had.
And just before we wrap up here, there's so many aspects of your job, so many different things that you do on a day-to-day basis. In your eyes, what do you think is the most challenging thing that you have to face in your role?
I think for me, it's that I don't have control over everything that happens next. So, I certainly didn't have any control over the crime itself, right? But then I also only have my one piece that I can really affect. And so I can advocate, I can speak up, but I cannot control what a judge does. I cannot control what a jury does. I cannot control what, the prosecutor's office does, or what their landlord does, or what their mom does, or anything else. And so, I want everything to go well for my victims, and I want things to be made whole for them. But, I can't control whether they end up having a hard day at the office and their boss gets onto them because of the trauma they've experienced, right? I don't get to convince a jury how to rule one way or the other, right? And so I tend to be a little bit more of a control freak. And so that's the part that's really difficult, is that I'm going to do as much as I can to advocate. But at the end of the day, it's out of my hands. And I think that is something that's particularly difficult for me.
No, I understand that. You always want the best for everyone, right? That's something that everyone wants for anyone that they care about. So I do appreciate that you said that. And I guess one final thing, for everyone listening, for our listeners, for the community of Austin, if they could get one thing from hearing you speak or from the Victim Services Unit as a whole, what would you want to leave them with, and what would you want them to know?
I think it's that we genuinely care about them. And so that sounds like such an obvious and kind of meaningless answer, but the counselors who work in victim services, again, we did not go into counseling to make money. We went into counseling because we genuinely care about people. And so, we want to see people succeed. We want to see, these are our neighbors, right? We want to see our neighbors thrive. And so, if somebody's on the fence about contacting victim services or engaging in any sort of process, then, we just kind of encourage them, like, there is someone who cares about them at the other end of the phone. And so that would kind of be my biggest thing, is that, to go ahead and reach out, because we do genuinely care and want the best for them.
I think we can all tell that you care by the way you talk. It's absolutely incredible. I know you guys do so much work. Most of it is behind the scenes. So, Emily, we do appreciate what you guys do. We see you. We know you make such a big difference in the Austin Police Department. We're grateful for the role that the Victim Services Unit provides. So thank you so much for joining us today, telling us a little bit more about what your job entails. And thank you for all the work you do. That's a hard job, and takes a special type of person to do it. So we really appreciate you, Emily. And for all our listeners, thank you so much for joining us today as well. For more information about community events with the Austin Police Department, if you want safety tips or news releases, you can follow us on our social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and X. That's the Austin Police Department. And if you have an idea of a topic that you want to see covered on a future episode of Keep Austin Safe, you can also send us an email at police3@AustinTexas.gov. That's the word police, the number 3 at Austin, Texas all the way spelled out .gov. We hope you find this conversation helpful and that it provides you with resources that help everyone keep Austin safe.